It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
David Harrison here of the Locked On Washington Commanders podcast to share with you that U.S. Cellular has some great news, especially for you, a person listening to this podcast. Right now, you can get one line with unlimited data for just $29.99. So unlike other cell networks, you won't have to pay for lines you don't need just to get that good price. Get one line for $29.99 with unlimited data today. U.S. Cellular, built for us. Terms apply. Visit uscellular.com for details.
We've already picked through most of the major news from across the NHL realm with the fantasy lens, but we're not done yet because we want you dominating that fantasy hockey draft upcoming. So we're breaking down some little moves from the Arizona Coyotes, Chicago Blackhawks, Florida Panthers, and of course, Boston Bruins on the Friday episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Let's get right to it.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, hockey heads, and welcome back inside the lab to your source for off-season fantasy hockey news, the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Mr. Steele Roden. It's your boy, Big Flip Livingstone. We are here to continue the off-season breakdown of all the news that you need to make sure your fantasy squad is in tip-top shape come September and draft season. So today we're taking a look at some smaller moves. We're rounding it up, baby, piece by piece, team by team, going for the Arizona Coyotes. A couple of moves that I want to talk to Steele about. This team, Steele, sneaky good. I know you got some respect for some of these fantasy pieces that we're going to shine a light on. Chicago Blackhawks. Maybe not as many angles here as we've talked about these moves, but there is a young player that you know I'm high on that I want to talk about, Steele. And Florida Panthers, Boston Bruins, two big Eastern Conference juggernauts, a little bit quieter, but also some moves that we want to talk about. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day, and thank you for continuing to make us your source all summer long for your fantasy needs. Steele, right over to you, because I think you've done a pretty good job of highlighting the Vemelkas of the world, some of these pieces, even Lawson Krause in banger leagues. I like the makeup of this team. If you're talking about what they have to work with, are they a playoff team? I don't know, but I'm really liking that first power play unit and actually what they have in their young mix.
Yeah, I like the direction the Arizona Coyotes are heading. We talked at length about this last season as well. They're heading in the right direction because it's been a rough go the last decade. They've only made the playoffs once in the last 10 years. They've struggled to even make it, past the bottom 5 of the NHL every single season. And when you look at this team at where they are right now, $16.3 million in cap space. You look at their draft picks. They have 10-plus draft picks every single year for the next 3 years. So they're loaded with draft picks there for the next 3 seasons. You look at the 3 guys or a few guys they brought in this offseason during the free agency signings. Alex Kerfoot, 2 years, $7 million. Jason Zucker, 1 year, $5.3 million. Taking these smaller left shot forward depth guys and veteran players, especially Jason Zucker. He brings a lot to the table for mentorship of these young caliber players like Clayton Keller and Nick Schmaltz. So I like the direction Arizona is heading, but for me, they still need to swing big and make a big trade for a superstar. They need to do something to entice star players to want to play in Arizona. You talk about, when we think about the last few months, Arizona is only mentioned because of Austin Matthews and his connection to being born and living in Arizona his entire life. That's the only reason Arizona gets some social media spoplight.
Or for the wrong reasons.
For the wrong reasons. They need to be in there for the right reasons. They need to somehow entice a big trade, a superstar, and also they need to do a better job at developing their players at a faster pace. It seems that they're so super slow and they take a bunch of risks with the selections they made. Like even this draft that just passed us by a few weeks ago, you go back to their first 2 selections in the draft. At number 6, they selected Dmitry Simashev, and then later on at number 12, Daniil Boot. So, and those were 2 guys that the analysts, the commentators, the reporters were saying that the Arizona Coyotes took them way too soon, a little bit of a reach. So it just seems with, in the front office, the organizations, they tend to make some questionable picks. and some questionable moves. They need to do a better job of trying to entice some stars into the organization.
And there's the obvious caveats of the off season, the ownership or the off ice issues, the ownership, lack of a real facility, playing in an NCAA arena. It's just a bunch of headaches. But actually, when I shine a light a little deeper, Dylan Guenther, Matthias Maselli, Clayton Keller, we've talked lots about. I love Nick Schmaltz. There are some valuable pieces here. And the left side of the D pairings, JJ Moser, Yusser Valimaki, and Sean Durzi, that's a pretty solid left side. Obviously, lots of holes throughout the lineup. They can't compete with those big-name players that you're mentioning because I agree that's what they seem to be always missing, because I think the rest of this lineup holds some fantasy value, and that was one of the takeaways for some of these teams as, we move down the list of major moves and the teams that made the biggest one steal. It's not always going to be pretty when it comes to your fantasy team. You're going to have to get a little nitty gritty, and you're going to have to go digging on some of these squads for some good angles. Nick Schmaltz, Clayton Keller, Jason Zucker. I don't know what this means for his value because he had such a good upcome year last year. I want to say this hurts his fantasy value because he's not going to get those looks with Sid and Gino. But overall, I still like Maselli. I really like Nick Schmaltz, and I think on the back end, you're going to see a big year from JJ Moser. But at the end of the day, this squad just remains a bottom feeder until they figure out what's going on off the ice and they get a real arena, because realistically, Steele, that is a whole joke. We'll save that conversation for another time. If you're okay, though, let's have a quick one about the Chicago Blackhawks.
Yeah.
A very quick one. We're keeping today's episode super, super short. So why don't we go after the break, Steele? We'll talk about the Blackhawks, Panthers, and Bruins really quickly. Today's episode is a short and sweet one. Thank you for tuning in. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting on the MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets back up to $200. That's right, just $20 wagered and you'll land $200 back in bonus bets. Win or lose, that's $200 you can spend betting on everything from the money line to the totals to who you think cranks that first dinger. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid out instantly. There's no better place to wager your bets on the MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 back in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.
There's no off-season for the true NHL fan, and there are no off days for Locked On NHL. This off-season, Locked On NHL has you taken care of. In just 30 minutes every day, Locked On NHL will give you the latest on all the fireworks of the NHL off-season. Locked On NHL, free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. We are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find your favorite sports team from all 4 major sports leagues and including the NCAA, your team every single day. And we appreciate all that love and support you show us. Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning is when you can find all of our episodes. We've got that hot content this offseason, this summer. It's still Gemini season out there, baby. We're still living it up. But Chicago Blackhawks, they're living it up right now. Yeah. Obviously, super excited to have drafted Connor Bedard, the first overall pick in the 2023 draft. Generational talent. Can't be more excited to see what he does in his NHL debut. We're going to have to wait a few months to see it, but we're still very excited. I'm not sure what there is to be excited about fantasy-wise for the Chicago Blackhawks team. I think you can obviously, pick a few different pieces to find some fantasy value. Obviously, that top line of what it has right now of Taylor Hall, Connor Bedard, and your boy Lucas Reichel, that could be some fantasy value on that top line. I do like the look. I like the look of the fourth line of Foligno, Donato, and Perry. Obviously, not a ton of fantasy value, but man, the second, third, and they just don't look that good.
They don't. It's a rebuild, but the rebuild is officially underway, and they're already ahead of the game when they get the luck of everything falling in their laps with Connor Bedard. We also talked about at length that this is a cornerstone franchise for the NHL, one that will not be bad for very long.
Yeah.
And this year, they're going to be bad. And it's going to be tough to gauge some of these pieces where you get them. Even Connor Bedard, because he's going into a tough situation in Chicago where they're going to lose a lot of games. And this kid isn't used to losing that much. That's a tough thing to handle in your first year in the NHL. But I think they've done a really good job of insulating him here, Steele. Corey Perry, Nick Foligno. This kid is not going to get pushed around. They're going to create a little bit of space out there for him. And my 3 targets are thusly. Connor Bedard for sure. Lucas Reichel is going to get a very, very good look in that top 6. Does he play on that right side? He's a natural left winger. I don't know. But he's proven that he can put up points at the AHL level. He's done with that. He's proven that he can put up points at the NHL level. And I think if he does get time with Bedard, Steele, double circle Lucas Reichel at the back end of your draft. You and I have also mentioned sometimes let go those bigger, flashier names and take a risk on a young player. Lucas Reichel double circled as one of those guys that I will be taking a shot on in my last 2 to 3 picks.
I like that as well. I think Lucas Reichel did show some sparks last season when he was in the lineup, and he showed some skill in the offensive production side of things. I'll also take a chance on a guy like Andreas Athanasiou. 40 points last year in 81 games. Very speedy, quick hands. He likes to shoot the puck, 175 shots. So hopefully he can just keep doing that for the Blackhawks. And like you said, I think so far Chicago, they understand the situation they're in. They're surrounding Connor Bedard with a little bit of some enforcers out there to protect him maybe a little bit if things go a little south. Even on the blue line, Jared Tenorti, Connor Murphy, Nikita Zaitsev, some big guys who can throw their weight around when they want to. So they're in this sticky situation right now. But again, they still have a ton of cap space to sign some free agents if they want, or even just look to the future. Next, though, on the list, the Florida Panthers have, addressed some blue line needs. Obviously, they've made some signings, 4 of them being defensemen, and absolutely crazy to see what they've done as well over the last few days. Florida Panthers signed Evan Rodriguez, 4 years, $12 million. I think that fills in that slot after having to trade Anthony Duclair as well. So they trade Duclair, they fill him with Evan Rodriguez. They signed Anthony Stolarz, Dmitry Kulikov, Nico Mikkola, Mike Riley, Oliver Ekman-Larsson. 3 veteran defensemen who just really don't produce that much fantasy value-wise. Even defensively, they're a little bit of a liability. But Florida really went out for the blue line defenseman this offseason.
Yeah, it makes sense, Steele, because I guess we really don't know what the future holds for Aaron Ekblad. I know he's under contract heavy. I don't think he's going anywhere. I more so mean, what is he going to hold this year fantasy-wise? We saw him have his ups and downs. At times he was amazing in the postseason, other times not so much. Last season he dealt with injuries. You and I have talked about where do you take him in the draft. Headed into this year, again, be very wary of taking him too high. At the end of the day, though, I love me some Carter Verhaeghe action. Alexander Barkov, Matthew Tkachuk. Matthew Tkachuk, you and I are going to talk a lot about the top 10 fantasy players in the game. He is definitely top 10. He might even be top 5 still. What a stud of a player. I think Florida is going to be in tough to repeat any kind of the magic that they had last postseason. I don't think that's a bold take. That's just facts. And I love the Evan Rodriguez signing. He is a very versatile forward that's proven he can slot up and down that lineup. You need him to play the wing on the third line? No problem. You need him to be the winger on your top line and eat some big minutes? No problem. So I think you're actually going to see a boost in Evan Rodriguez's value because he's going to get, I think, a lot more opportunity to be a regular top sixer in the mix in Florida.
Yeah, 39 points in 69 games last year, 43 the season prior to that with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So really elevated his game, and he's really come up from his time in Buffalo, obviously going to Pittsburgh right after, getting that opportunity when Pittsburgh was struggling with all those injuries. He played with Sidney Crosby on the top line. That really helped him blossom into the player he is right now. He is going to be 30 years old at the end of July. So he is getting up there in age, but it seems like it's at the perfect time in his career to be playing with these superstar players. And you're right. If he's playing with, guys like Barkov and Matthew Tkachuk in the top 6. Mm-hmm. He's a 20-goal scorer. He's decent on the power play on that left-hand side. He does bring a decent amount of peripheral stats, 184 shots. Blocks and hits are a little bit lower than usual this past year, but again, he was injured for a little bit. So definitely like the signing. They get him for 4 years, $3 million. Great deal. They acquire some veteran defensemen to help on the blue line while Montour and Ekblad recuperate and hopefully get fully healthy for the start of next season. But yeah, Florida Panthers, it will be hard to try to recreate what they just did this past year.
And now they have a bit of a target on their back. They're not going to be surprising clubs. They're not going to be, deemed as pushovers or people who are a team that's not supposed to be there. So at the end of the day, kudos due to a Florida Panthers squad that did come out of nowhere. Just again, this is what we've said. Don't let your last memory of all these players or the team who, even though they lost, right, they were studs in the postseason. Yeah. Don't overreach for them in this upcoming draft. But maybe the Boston Bruins did a little bit of reaching with some of these moves, Steele. We've been predicting a downfall. Is this the year the Boston Bruins finally take a step back? Let's talk about it right after the break.
It might be, and I do have a question for you, or not even a question, more just like a quick conversation about Tyler Bertuzzi and Taylor Hall and everything that happened with the Boston Bruins as well. I know we've talked about that a little bit, but yeah, they have re-signed. They have brought back a few guys. They have signed a couple of young players as well. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Please hammer that subscribe and that follow button. We appreciate all that love and support you show us every single day. Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning is when you can find all of our episodes of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast with your boy, Flip Livingstone and Steel Road. And thank you so much for tuning in every single day. Boston Bruins, they pretty much started things off with that trade, sending Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno to the Chicago Blackhawks. That really kicked things off with that trade before the free agency frenzy happened. Boston Bruins, though, they bring back Milan Lucic on a 1-year, $1 million deal. They also bring in Morgan Geekie to a 2-year, $4 million deal, $2 million AAV, as well as James Van Riemsdyk on a 1-year, $1 million. And am I forgetting anyone else? I think those were the top 3 for the Boston Bruins.
They were the top 3. They also got even older and slower, bringing in Kevin Shattenkirk, who, given his age, I think he put up about 30 or so points last year. Not completely useless when it comes to the NHL world. But my goodness, the Boston Bruins got really old and really slow in a hurry with these offseason moves. Yeah. Aside from Morgan Geekie, I actually think Morgan Geekie's value goes way up, and I think he's going to get a good chance to be that second-line center. And if he gets any sniffs on the power play with David Pastrnak at all, his value goes up even more. And that was my main takeaway here is I don't know about these moves still. I don't know about what this future holds for the Boston Bruins, but I'll say this. James Van Riemsdyk coming in, if he gets a chance to play with David Pastrnak, I don't know how much he will, but I know he's had some banged up seasons. Whoever gets to play with David Pastrnak, this is what I wanted to say, is one of those dudes that you want to maybe add week to week for a little offensive boost, because say what you will about the rest of this squad, David Pastrnak is still elite.
He is elite. And, this is the tough thing right now. If Bergeron and Krejci do not come back and they officially retire and just call it quits, call it a career with the Boston Bruins down the middle is nothing to be fond of right now. Pavel Zacha at number 1, Charlie Coyle at number 2, Morgan Geekie at number 3, and then Patrick Brown at number 4. I don't even know who Patrick Brown is.
Yeah, no offense.
But that will be tough. So without Krejci and Bergeron, it's definitely tough looking for the Boston Bruins down the middle. But I think you're right. I think Morgan Geekie is the one that I'm most excited about. I think at 24 years old, he's coming into a situation where he could be that second line centerman, really develop his game with guys like DeBrusk, with Pastrnak, with Brad Marchand. So I think out of all 3 of those deals, the Morgan Geekie one, fantasy-wise, is the most exciting for me for overall NHL take and everything, I love Milan Lucic coming back to the Boston Bruins. I think that's just another caveat to try to get Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci to come back. Maybe that even can get Zdeno Chara out of retirement, bring him back to the Boston Bruins. That would be incredible. Could you imagine Brad Marchand, Patrice Bergeron, David Krejci, Zdeno Chara, and Milan Lucic back on the Boston Bruins for one final season?
They better get the gurneys, the crutches, and all the physical aids ready to go, because that'll be one banged up squad. Yeah, at the end of the day, they still have the best goaltending tandem coming into the headed into the season, arguably. I think at the end of the day, say what you will about what's going to happen for this team, there is going to be more moves coming, I think, here, Steele. It just doesn't make any sense the way we know the Boston Bruins aren't going to stand pat on this situation. They've made some decent peripheral moves here. Let's see what happens. But I think realistically, Morgan Geekie is going to get all the chance in the world to be that second line center, because at least one of those two guys you named, Krejci and Bergeron, at least one, if not both, I see definitely not coming back. Maybe one does. That still leaves a big hole up the middle in Boston. So why not Morgan Geekie? Also, third-round pick, and he's only 24 years old.
Very excited about what the future holds with him in Boston, with the Bruins organization. But that's what I wanted to ask you real quick was, I think, when you look back to the Taylor Hall trade, when they trade him and Foligno to the Chicago Blackhawks, I think they were doing that to free up some cap space or just free up some room to re-sign Tyler Bertuzzi. They really wanted to re-sign Tyler Bertuzzi. They thought that they could get him in free agency. And I think that's why they made that deal with Taylor Hall. But then I think that they were very shocked to see Bertuzzi sign with the Maple Leafs. So that's another hole. It kind of left the Bruins looking a little bit like a very bad offseason so far.
And you know what? I think it was kind of aligning that they were going to at least take a good run at him. Did it mean it was going to happen? No. And he is the prototypical Boston Bruins player. Am I happy that he's a part of the Toronto Maple Leafs organization? 100%. That's my favorite signing of the early Treliving era. But at the end of the day, the Boston Bruins, we talked about corner franchises at the start of the episode with the Blackhawks. This is one of those squads and I have been a victim of it as well. Just when you start to count them out, they reel off the best season in NHL history. Is that going to happen again? I don't think so. Are they going to be in tough to make the playoffs? I'm going to go out there and say, yes, they are. Watch them go out there and add an absolute superstar somehow. They'll trade one of those goalies. Something else is going to happen here, Steele. You mentioned the earlier moves. Keep it tapped to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, and we'll break it all down for you.
Yeah, we'll try not to be as wrong as before with our predictions on the Boston Bruins. We'll try our best. We don't always succeed, but we always try our best over here. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast your first listen every single day. Make sure you're tuning in Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern time is when you can find all of our episodes. Thank you again so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day. Good luck with all your summer bets out there. And we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Monday. Peace.